Hi everyone, welcome to our first PowerPoint presentation for Unit 1. In this PowerPoint, I just want to introduce you to some of the concepts that we will be going over this semester and give you a bit of a foundation for getting started for studying the law. So I thought it would be appropriate, really, in a class about the law to start off by defining the law. What I would love to do if we were meeting face-to-face was really ask you guys what would be a good definition of the law. And you can take a look at some of the definitions that I have here. But I think what you will see, what they all have in common is that the law is a set of rules that a society agrees to be bound by. And we set those rules up and we agree to live by them. And we're going to study a lot of the different laws this semester, like criminal laws and property law. But the other part of the law that's really important is that it's not just what are the laws, but what are the consequences for not following the law, not adhering to the law? And that might be a punishment or a remedy for the person that's been injured. So a lot of what we'll talk about this semester is not just what the law is itself, which is important, but also what are the consequences for not adhering to or following those laws. And then a related concept is actually comes out of that last definition I have there, which is that there's a lot of interpretation that goes into the law. It might seem like we all might agree to a certain rule or guidance that we put down in writing, but then when we take that rule and we apply it to real life scenarios, there's a lot of room for interpretation about what that law could mean. So as we move this through the semester, we're going to talk about the particular laws of different areas. We're going to talk about the consequences for not following those laws. And we'll also talk about lots of different ways in which to interpret the laws, which is, I think, what makes the law so exciting and makes it alive. So a little bit about classifying the law. So one of the early concepts that I want you to be aware of, and this is described in more detail in a written document and a handout right here in Unit 1, is the difference between a civil law system and a common law system. The United States has what's called a common law system. Common law systems are systems of law that are heavily developed based on a concept called precedent. And that's a word that we use to describe court cases when they resolve disputes between parties. That means individuals or businesses. The courts give us rules of law, and then our future behavior is all guided by that precedent. And we call that the common law. It's an idea that the law develops over time from one court case to another court case. And the entire United States country is a common law system. Some countries have chosen instead to adopt a civil law system, and as described in the handouts under this unit, that is a system where the individuals and the laws operate by a written code. Now, we do have written code in the United States as well. Those are our statutes. Those are our laws that are developed from the legislative branch that we'll talk about in the next couple of units. But we still rely heavily on the court's interpretation of what the legislature says. And that's what makes the common law different from the civil law system. Now that you know what common law means here, what civil law means here, let's complicate this just a little bit more and talk about the differences between civil law and criminal law. So this is another classification in the law that's really important for us to talk about here at the beginning of the semester. In the United States, so now we're not talking about other countries, we're just talking about the United States. All of our laws can be broken down into being laws that are criminal or laws that are civil. And there's a really easy way to keep track of this. Criminal laws are all the laws that involve crimes. So burglary, arson, murder, these are, theft, assault, and battery. These are all criminal laws, and you could put them in one box over here. And any law that is not a criminal law, we call a civil law. So that box is much bigger, and that will include a lot of other topics that we're going to study this semester, like the law of slip and fall, which is called torts, contracts, property law, topics we won't even cover this semester, like employment discrimination, intellectual property. Those are all the civil laws. So we're going to cover both this semester. We have 2 units on criminal law later this semester. We'll talk about both substantive and procedural criminal law, and everything else we do is going to be civil law because that's the way our legal system operates. But I want to highlight for you some of the key differences between criminal law and civil law because we have both of these matters proceeding in our courts at the same time. So one important distinction is that when it comes to criminal matters, when there has been a harm, like a crime committed, like let's say I'm here, I'm actually at my kitchen table and I'm working and a burglar, we'll just call him Bob, breaks into my house and he steals some things. He's committed a crime. When the police arrest him and charge him with a crime and the case proceeds to court against Bob to charge him with the crime of burglary, the party that brings the case is the government. If Bob has committed a state crime, then the state government, also called the district attorney or prosecutor's office, brings the case against Bob, who we call the defendant. If Bob has committed, allegedly, a federal crime, then the federal government or the U.S. attorney will bring the case against Bob. And that is how a criminal case proceeds. A civil case proceeds differently. A civil case is really considered a private harm. So let's use an example of a slip and fall. Let's say before class today, I was out at Market Basket and I slipped on a banana peel on the floor and I fell and I hypothetically broke my wrist and I now have a medical bill and I also have some time I've missed from work and I want to sue Market Basket for my injuries. Can I rely on the state to bring that case for me? Not at all. I, as the private individual, need to sue Market Basket for something called negligence, which we will learn about in our unit on tort law. And that is a civil matter. I am called the plaintiff in that scenario, not the district attorney, not the prosecutor, although Market Basket is still called the defendant. So in a civil case, we talk about a plaintiff choosing to bring her case against the defendant. Whereas in criminal law, we rely on the state, whether the federal government or the state government, to bring the case against the defendant. That is a huge difference between how criminal law and civil law proceed. There are, of course, other differences, which I've highlighted for you here too. I just want to go over a couple of them. One of them is the result. Remember, we were just talking about consequences. What are the consequences for breaking a law? Well, in a criminal case, the consequences can be very severe. In fact, we talk about a loss of liberty when it comes to a criminal case, that a defendant who was found guilty of a crime could be sentenced to jail or prison time. And so that's very severe. Whereas in a civil case, the most severe penalty a defendant can suffer for not adhering to the rules of law are money damages. So a defendant in a civil case will never be sentenced to jail, will never experience a loss of liberty. Now, of course, their money damages could be very high. They could be in the millions of dollars, may even cause a defendant to declare bankruptcy. But that's not the same thing as being ordered to go to prison and lose your liberty. Similarly, when we talk about criminal cases, because the loss of liberty is so severe, the standard that a plaintiff, the standard that the government needs to prove its case to say that this defendant is guilty of the crime is the highest standard possible. Those are the words there, beyond a reasonable doubt. We want that jury, who are the fact finders, to be as close to 100% sure as possible that this defendant committed this crime. That's what we mean by beyond a reasonable doubt, because there's a loss of liberty at stake. How about a civil case? A civil case, again, we're talking about money damages at worst. And so we lower the burden of proof to something called preponderance of the evidence. It still means that a jury needs to find that this defendant is liable more likely than not, but not quite as high as beyond a reasonable doubt. The other thing I just want to pause and mention here is notice that I use the word liable when it comes time to civil cases. In civil cases, we don't talk about guilt or innocence of the defendant. Those words are only used in the criminal context. In the civil context, we use liability. That means legally responsible for someone else's actions. So in my example of me going to Stop and Shop or me going to Market Basket and slipping on a banana peel that had been, let's say, on the floor for a few hours, if I win my case, Market Basket is held liable. All right, let me move on and talk about a couple of other concepts before I reach the end of this PowerPoint. I do want to mention a little bit about the sources of law. We will refer to the Constitution a few times throughout the semester. The Constitution is our framework of government. It's the document that got the founding fathers, not the founding mothers, together to say, here's what our government is going to look like, here's how our laws are going to be made, and here's the branches of government that are being charged with making laws and interpreting laws. As we move through units 2 and 3, we will talk much more extensively about the legislative branch, the judicial branch, and the executive branch, and how they interact with each other and all make law. The other interesting concept that's embedded in the Constitution that gives us so much to talk about throughout every unit of this class and really in your daily lives is this concept of federalism. This is the idea that when the country was founded, you got those 13 original colonies, they're the ones over on the East Coast, and they were breaking away from a controlling British government. And the 13 colonies, they wanted some unification, they wanted some national government to govern them. But all 13 still kind of wanted their own individual way of handling their matters. And so the result of that is that we end up with this federal system where we have one government that is the national, also called federal government. And that's, of course, based in Washington, D.C. And when the national government passes laws, it applies to all of us in all 50 states. But we also end up with 50 different states also with their own branches of government making laws. And we know that the laws can differ from state to state. Just look at the age of obtaining your driver's license that can be different in different states. The same thing with minimum wage that is not the same in every state. So we know through our daily lives that the laws change from state to state. But this makes it both exciting and complicated for us studying the law, because it's exciting and interesting that states can vary in their laws so much. But it's also complicated because that means, as individuals who are studying the law, there are 51 different legal systems operating in the United States at the same time. And that doesn't even include local ordinances that we're not really going to get into. It makes our study, as I said, both interesting and complicated. As we go through the semester, we will talk about which laws are federal and which laws are state. And I'll do a little bit more emphasis on Massachusetts law since we're here. Last but not least, I just want to use this as a launching pad to talk about how this class is organized. We will start off the first 3 weeks of the semester, including the one we're in now, talking about the organization of our government, how our laws are organized, and how our government works. From the 3rd to the 4th week, we will transition into a really thick unit in Unit 4 about how to read a court decision. So we're going to break it down. We're going to see how judges make law. And so that way we understand how precedent works. And it's a really informative unit that will help us throughout the rest of the semester. After that, we'll devote 1 unit to a different topic each semester, hitting as many big topics in the law as I can in our short 15 weeks together. So that includes individual liberties, torts, contracts, family law, property, and of course, as I mentioned earlier, a couple of units on criminal law and procedure, finally finishing off with the semester with how civil court cases proceed. That's a lot in one semester, but I look forward to going through all of it with you, and I look forward to reading your discussion board post for the first unit. Thanks for listening to the first PowerPoint, other than the welcome PowerPoint, of course.